Welcome to Behind the Sims. At SaberSim, we're a team of professional gamblers, data scientists, and sports nerds building the best DFS optimizer and sports betting model on the market. This podcast is a behind-the-scenes look at how we do it. Every episode is an unedited recording of our team's actual conversations as we research, analyze, and iterate our way to answering the tough questions in DFS and sports betting. Whether we're answering questions like what's the best way to build your bankroll, analyzing different ways to diversify, or even building new models, we're going to share it all right here, and we aren't holding anything back. If you're ready to go deep into what it really takes to win, then this is a podcast for you. All right, so we are back with another installment of Behind the Sims. Still trying to figure out exactly how we want to do this. These are meant to be we're not trying to change the way we're working for the show. What we're trying to do is just surface this so that anyone watching gets a better idea of what we're doing behind the scenes and how we work, what we're working on, all that. But so what I'm going to do though at the beginning is kind of break the third or fourth wall. I forget what they call it, but just by doing a little bit of an intro before we just dig into our call. So I'm Andy Baldacci, the CEO of SaberSim. We've got Elijah, who is a Columbia data science grad student right now and interning with us for the summer. And Matt, who is the founder of SaberSim. And really, the big thing that we're trying to tackle or just trying to improve is just how we measure the work that we do. And through the contest selection research that we did, that really brought a shift about for me and how I think about this, because for the longest time, DFS just hasn't, frankly, been that data driven. That's not to say creating projections and everything else doesn't rely exclusively on data, but just in everything around that and all the meta analysis. There just hasn't been the data to back it up. It's been using experience and other things that help, but we wanted to go deeper. As our team has grown and we have more resources, we think it's important that we test our assumptions. If we're building new features, we want to make sure that they do what we set out for them to do. And so I think the simplest example is a lot of what we do that makes us different is we do a lot of the heavy lifting under the hood, so that rather than having you come in and have to program all sorts of rules, we're able to take advantage of all the data we have through our simulations to automate away some of that busy work. But it's not always clear what's going on there. And so what we want to do is first just make sure we're actually achieving what we want to. And second, just give more context around that to you. And so the big thing that we've done is build out a framework that lets us test these assumptions in a rigorous way. Eric laid the groundwork in the contest selection research that he did, which simulates out contests using actual lineups thousands of times so that we can see all the different ways that individual contests can play out, so we can measure ROI in the long run, as well as look at the variance of different strategies. And what we had to change was making it so that rather than looking only at lineups that already have been built, that's helpful for analyzing what's actually happening right now in the games, in the contests. But it doesn't let us test things that we're doing to change the lineup building process. And so Matt put in a lot of time to make it so that we can generate lineups for past states in bulk using different settings and testing different things, basically put those into contests and see how they would have done. And so I think I actually haven't had a ton of conversations with you, Matt, about this recently.
We've kind of planned it out, but we haven't talked since I actually built it. So
so I think just to shift back into kind of how we would have normally done a call like this, or normally will do a call like this, is just, can you just get me up to speed on, I gave the high level, am I accurate in that? What did you actually build and what's it look like?
Yeah. So I like you said, I took kind of Eric's framework and sort of standardized some things. And I've been playing around with contest sim stuff just for my own um, you know research purposes and for a while. And so I had some stuff of my own that I kind of inserted in there. So basically, what I built was like um, like you said, you described it well. It's a contest simulation framework. So what I we do is essentially like we've got all of this contest data in our database with all basically all the entries in um, DraftKings contests, and so we will like grab the data for a given contest. And so what I did is like we can kind of query like which contest we want to get based on some of the parameters that we set. So we might want to say like, okay, give me like the 150 max contest entry fee between $10 and $20 with the number of entrants between 10,000 and 50,000, but we can kind of set that however we want, so we can test different types of contests without having to know the exact ID of the contest. Then we will get the data, we'll kind of clean all of it and match it up with our internal player IDs, and then we basically score. So we have all of the actual lineups that went into the contest from the actual users, and then we stick those into our sims and we score those actual lineups in the contest, so that like in each of our internal sims of the game, each of those lineups has a score. And so how we do it is because each game is independent in the sims, so we sort of like shuffle around the sims, so we're making sure that they're not we're not just saying like index 0 for each of the games, because that we want to make sure that we don't like match up the sims with. So like say we have 5,000 sims of each game. We won't just say like, okay, for this sim of the contest, we're going to take like the first sim of every single game. We like shuffle around. Basically, the harm is that when we want to make sure that when we're simulating the contest, we're not using the exact same sims for each game as when we're building our lineups. And not that the lineup building is necessarily like using the same sims, but like say we use the first sim of every game when we like build our lineups. And so like the first lineup that we get is like the optimal lineup. If you have sim precision at 10, it's like the optimal lineup from like this first sim, and then we're testing that against the same sims
to build our lineups. It's of course it's going to look amazing. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And so we want to just make sure that we're sort of like randomly sampling the sims.
Let me try to obviously rephrase this and then tell me if I'm accurate. So there's two components. There's one, how we build our lineups, which uses our sims. We've got a ton of content if people want to learn more about that, specifically like sim precision and how we factor all that in. But then we have the other part of how do we sim out the contests themselves? How do we say these all occur? And so if we grade the contest using the same sim that built the lineup, it's like you're going to get skewed results because the lineup was built perfectly for that sim. And so like if that's what's we're judging against, it's just not going to be accurate. So by shuffling it up, we're making sure that it's possible there's overlap, but it will be rare. It will be random. We're just saying, and just like it's possible that like the sim you use perfectly lines up with whatever happens in reality. So we're just saying to separate those two processes, right?
Yeah. And like to foreshadow a little bit, I still think that is an issue that we're going to have to work through a little bit of that kind of the bias of using the same sims to evaluate the lineups as we do to build them. Obviously, like the shuffling means we're not getting like the same sims for every game, but it's still like if in one of the sims Mike Trout hits 3 home runs and gets like 40 fantasy points, like that sim is still going to be used in like at least one of the lineups, and then like also going to be using that to evaluate. So we might, later on want to think about different ways to separate that out, but it's not like we're using the same sim for every single game independently. But
And
that
I
is,
mean,
I think,
assuming our sims are accurate, I guess I don't see the inherent problem with that, because like that is what we're saying is like an actual outcome. So like,
yeah, no, it is an actual
yeah,
outcome. It's just that there are millions of possible outcomes, and we're simulating
okay,
thousands of times.
okay,
And so I think that's the kind of one potential bias, and we kind of are seeing that even in the initial numbers that are coming back. Is like, okay, we're getting like much higher ROIs in these lineups that is reasonable, because
yeah.
we're using we have the bias of our own sims. But
And I think where I view this is, we're not, just like with with the contest selection stuff, we were seeing is everyone's ROI based on our sims. We're not saying those are like their actual ROIs.
right,
And I
yeah,
think in this it's similar, where like my goal with any of this isn't to say here is the exact improvement result, whatever that you're going to get from any of these changes. But what we want to show as we test different things is relative. We want to say, is this better than what was in place before? And I think what I'll talk about now is just kind of where I talked to you a bit about it, Matt, and I think I probably mentioned some of the stuff to Elijah, but the plan really is we've got a lot of exciting features in the works. One is a lineup diversifier. And the goal with that is saying, okay, if you use this, it will lower your variance. The question then is, okay, first, like, does that work? So that'll be relatively easy for us to check. But there's going to be trade-offs. Just like if you hedge bets, you're paying some fee for that. We want to also be able to measure, like, how much are you paying for this? Like, how much do you have to sacrifice in terms of ROI to get the lower variance? And I think traditionally, this is where we would work more of like a thought experiment, where we think about it a lot and check if it passed the eye test, and just like do as much qualitative analysis as we could to be confident in our findings. But I think we need to go further in this, just because like that's sort of our approach. Is we're not going to be just screaming about how great we are. We want to make sure like we're confident in that. Like if we're giving people functionality that we say is going to help them, we want to be sure it's true. And that's like one specific example, but go for it.
Sorry, I mean, I can kind of explain further like how we'll do that methodology with the sim if you want. But yeah, so like you said, yes. So essentially, like after we score the entries, the part that you're talking about with testing is essentially we'll like build lineups on our end, and then we can like stick any set of lineups. Essentially, it could be built by SaberSim, it could be built from somewhere else, if we wanted to set that up. And because basically it's just like a list of players, right? And so it's just like a lineup that we as long as like we can match up the players to our sims and everything, we essentially will like score those lineups in the same way that they score the entries. And then we just take in every sim, like, okay, where did this lineup place in that individual sim? How much did it win based on the entry fee of the contest? And then we have all these metrics at the end of like, okay, on average, like this is what the average return of every lineup in this set. But then we also have like the ranges of outcomes, the median ROI. We can look at some other metrics around, portfolio optimization and all this kind of stuff. So, basically this framework is essentially to be able to like figure out the performance of a set of lineups in a contest in our sims, and essentially, simulate them out, find the winnings in each sim, and like be able to determine like what our sims say is the end ROI, but like you said, what we more care about is the relative ROI.
Yeah, we're not putting
Yeah.
like we're not trying to measure the ROI or variance for its own sake. We're not just like putting in a single data point. We're saying, okay, here's how lineups used to be built with whatever was before it. Here's what we're proposing to change it with, comparing both of those and seeing what's best, or like multiple variables. I want to jump in to get more practical and talk a bit about the work Elijah's doing now. But just for my understanding, this is not as though there's like a GUI or an interface that I could click buttons on to kick these off. Like when you say like you tell it what contests to select, like, how does that work?
Yeah, so how I set it up is I have kind of all the framework there, and that it's in the code. We could set up an interface for this, and it wouldn't be that difficult. But essentially, like Elijah's going in here, and he's essentially just like editing the inputs to this script that is running, and so the first thing he's determining is like, okay, which contest do we want to simulate? And so he can either just input like a specific contest ID if there's one he knows of. It's like, okay, I want to like test the flagship MLB $15 contest from this specific date. Or he can just input like this number of entries, max entries per user, entry fee as like the parameters, and we'll just find a contest that matches those parameters, starting at with some start date. But that's something that Elijah is playing around with, and he can kind of adjust how we query those contests. But once we have the contest to simulate, then so there's not a interface or anything. It's in the code, but the other thing that Elijah is doing here, and this is getting into the actual project, is basically kicking off a bunch of lineup builds in SaberSim that
is he literally using?
I mean, not in SaberSim. Okay. Sorry, no. It's just kicking them off with a script that
it's using our builder, but just not
using our builder. Yes, as if he had done it from the front end, but automated so that he doesn't have to do a bunch of button clicks.
Right.
So it'll just kick off a bunch of builds based on the settings that he inputted. So as like an example, when I gave this project to him, I kind of have some code that essentially it has these default settings, and then it iterates through all these combinations of like correlation and sim precision, and so it'd be like all of the correlations between 0 and 10, all of the variance, the sim precision between 0 and 10, and so there's 121 different, because there's like there's 11 different options, so it's 121
the project
combinations of those two.
Backtest and optimize our sliders.
Right. Yeah. So it'll kick off all those builds, like save the IDs of all the builds, and then once they're complete, it'll go through every single build and analyze, simulate those lineups from the build into the contest that was chosen or that was queried. So, like I said, it is something that we could automate or not automate, but have a little bit, have an interface for it in the future. I think, especially it would be cool to be able to like upload a CSV of lineups, and so we could compare like, okay, a lineup's built like with SaberSim versus other optimizers or something like that, or just like different ways. You could build your lineups in SaberSim and then maybe even input the ID and be able to test it that way. But yeah, and right now we're just looking at the lineup pool overall rather than a specific set of lineups. So we're just doing like builds of 500, which is kind of
and so I'll give some context and let me know if I'm missing anything. And Elijah, we will let you talk at some point, I promise. But we are backtesting our sliders. We are trying to determine in SaberSim, when you start a build, you tell us what contest you're playing, the style, entry limit, number of entrants. We adjust correlation, ownership fade, and sim precision. to build lineups best suited for those types of contests. We had back tested this in the past, and what that was more of a literal back test where it would not sim out the contests as far as I know. It would just build lineups for a bunch of past contests and just see how they would do in different settings. So that's frankly way more than anybody else is doing as far as testing like their default settings go. But we wanted to, with this new framework, retest those assumptions with something we think is much more rigorous. And so the plan is just to go through all the different combinations and then actually look at the relevant contests and see how the lineups do based on that. And so, yeah, Elijah, do you want to just like talk a little bit about what you've been doing? Because I haven't caught up with you on like the day-to-day of this. So like, how far into this are you? What have you been doing so far?
Yeah, so I'm just getting started with this. But the framework that Matt built out is like super helpful for getting this. And in terms of like having an interactive like GUI, as you're saying, like I see that being an easy second step here, because once I run the backtest, like you can have a CSV of lineups and their performances, and anyone can like literally see how different slider settings impact the ROI. So where I'm at now is, as Matt was saying, like he gave me some default input settings. So what I did was I just found like a medium-sized set of GPPs and just tried some initial builder settings just to see kind of what the ROIs look like. My plan with this is to, as kind of you guys were saying, like run through a full back test of every possible combination, run that through several different types of contests to see if there's significant patterns in sort of how different build settings obviously perform differently in different types of contests.
And there'll be,
yeah,
to make sure I'm thinking about, there's 10 set like options for each slider. So is that what, 1,000?
So yeah,
okay.
So it's 1,200 something, and that would just be for one contest, right? And in order for this to be statistically significant and like honest, I think it makes sense to do this for sort of a portfolio of contests that are within a bucket of, say, large GPPs, cash games. So like I'm looking to do full 1,200, whatever the total number of builds are for a random set of a bunch of contests.
But I guess just to make sure I'm understanding it right,
sure,
you're not going to have to build all 1,200 whatever different sets of lineups for each contest types, like, because those are going to be the lineups we built independently. So it's like you'll first build however many lineups for each of those settings, but then if you're comparing 1, 2, 3 for correlation, ownership, fade, sim precision for a cash game versus a GPP, like you don't need to build separate lineups for those, because like the settings are what dictate the lineups. Or am I thinking about it wrong?
I mean, I'm pretty sure that, I mean, Matt, you can jump in here, but like, does the number of entries in the contest, shouldn't that also impact the way in which lineups are built or
but
no?
Yeah. What Andy's
the way
saying,
that it
though,
changes
is
the sliders.
Yeah. What Andy's saying is, though, so we didn't actually build it. We kind of choose the contest first and then build. I mean, that's essentially an efficiency thing. We still need to do a few different.
Well, this seems like a pretty big efficiency thing.
Yeah.
Well, but it's only, you can only do that one like per slate, right? So there's like,
okay, fair.
We still need like a sample of different, because we don't just care about the contest type, but also like the size of the slate. So like a 2-game slate is obviously much different than a 15-game slate, and we want to test like all these different slate sizes as well. But yeah, no, that is a good point. We didn't set it up that way, but I think it would be pretty straightforward to. We probably should do that. So like we should talk about that, Elijah.
Yeah.
Because essentially we weren't necessarily saying like, okay, like we're testing all these different contests like on the same slate. We're just saying like we'll have just sort of a sample of different, a sample of like a handful of slates for a specific contest type. So I think we're kind of reversing the order of how we were, like the hierarchy of how we were thinking about this a little bit, where we weren't thinking about like, okay, we have this slate and then we have these contests for this slate, and like let's test like all the settings combinations on these different contest types. It's but yeah, I think obviously, yeah, we don't want to have to build 1,200 different builds for the same slate multiple times.
That makes sense.
Right.
But it would be easy to, like, we have, it returns all the build IDs. So once we do it once, you can essentially just like print out, save all of those build IDs, and then just like use those, just kind of have that set and apply that to other contests for the same slate. We might even want to just, I mean, this is getting a little bit in process, but like we could, before even doing the contest sim, like we could just build all the lineups ahead of time, save all of the process IDs for like the different slates, and then go in and say like, okay, these are the builds for this slate, these are the builds for this slate, and then apply those to the contests. So yeah, it'll just be a little bit of re-engineering of like the workflow for that. It's not going to change like the framework itself. It's just how we like input.
And then
those builds.
I know you only have a couple of minutes, Matt.
No, I've got a little bit more time. So.
Oh, you did? Okay, cool. Then, so one of the things I wanted to check with is like, we're talking about grouping like contests into buckets so that's easier to analyze. Is that something that is done automatically? Like, this is definitely the wrong like terminology, but like, are we tagging these contests in the database and saying, okay, this fits that bucket, this fits that, like as they come in, or whenever Elijah, whoever does analysis, he's got to go in and build the buckets?
No, I mean, I think that's, Elijah, you can chime in, but what we've talked about is like, that's part of what Elijah is figuring out, is what are the correct buckets for that. Because right now, obviously in the app, we have like these drop downs of like 10 to 50,000 entrants and 50,000 plus, but like, we don't necessarily know that those are the correct breakpoints. And so part of what I think we want to see is like, obviously we want to backtest the best slider settings, but we also want to see like, are those the correct breakpoints? Is there a meaningful difference in settings between 5,000 entrant contest and 15,000? Like, where should we set those breakpoints? And so,
and
I think
to be clear, the only breakpoint you're talking about is number of entrants right now.
Well, but for like, any of them,
there's lots of settings. Yeah.
Sure, but like, we're not gonna.
Yeah, the 150
GPP
max versus 20 max,
like cash, and like the others. I'm saying like we don't have they're not arbitrary buckets. It's like these just are the buckets that are given.
The entry
like
size,
entry limit in the style. Like we know those are definite things, and there's not like
the other thing.
GPP.
Right. Well, the other thing that I had in mind that I talked to Elijah about is the entry fee, which we don't have a drop down for that in the app right now. But depending on these findings, maybe what we want to add one, if there's like a really meaningful difference between a like the exact same contest in terms of size and entry limit, but the entry fee is different. If there's like a meaningful difference in how the backtest results look, like the optimal settings, obviously there'll be a difference in ROI.
Correct. Exactly.
But if the sim is saying like, okay, you
need different settings for
you want to use 8 correlation for the mini max, but you want to use 5 correlation for the $15 at the same exact other parameters, then like maybe we should add a entry fee drop down so that we can account for that. So like that's another thing. So I think that I want that to be part of this analysis of like, let's see what the patterns look like, of how these optimal settings sort of change based on the contest sizes. And so I see what I would like to see a more like continuous, rather than just assuming the buckets ahead of time. Like, let's look at the data, make it a bit more continuous so we can have a bunch of different options, and then let's like figure out which buckets make sense based on the results. So I feel like
the only guidance I would have here is just making sure we don't go too far down the rabbit hole on this, because at the end of the day, like Eric Jordan and I definitely got into this trap where we were thinking too theoretical without actually just looking at what are like. There's not a ton of contests that have the exact same parameters, just with a different buy-in. it's usually like the number of entrants is going to change significantly as well. And so we just don't want to, I think those are factors we want to isolate and do our best to figure out the buckets. But I think in reality, it's not going to be as granular as we think it could be, just because like we have to work with the actual contests that are built. And so we just don't want to go too ham on that analysis.
Yeah. I think for NFL, it'll be a little bit different because there's so many more contests to choose from that like you can choose like a $5 contest that's 10,000 entrants or 50,000 entrants or 200,000. Like there's more options, like more types of contests. Whereas MLB, it's like there's pretty much the same contest run and there's not that many of them. So yeah, I definitely agree with that. We don't want to go too crazy. Like, but you know, the thing is, we're not like creating theoretical contests here, so we're only pulling from real contests, anyway. So it's not like we can just create like tests.
No. But what I'm saying is like we don't want to be doing a bunch of analysis and then the reality is it just doesn't matter. There's not that many different options.
Yeah. I mean, that's like part of what I'm doing too, is like I'm making sure that I'm pulling a significant sample size like of each type of contest. So that way, like it should make sense in terms of being a practical application of it. I'm like, I think also what's nice is because I'm not like I don't have as in-depth of a DFS background as the rest of the team. Like I can, in the effort of being like more empirically data driven, like I'm looking for patterns and things that may not be immediately intuitive to someone who's like has a lot of DFS experience in terms of even bucketing the contest into like why smaller GPPs may have different performance than bigger GPPs.
How long? So say we change the process so that we first generate the lineups and then look at the select the contests.
Yeah.
If that's in place, how long does the actual analysis take, and is it automated?
Yeah, I mean, Elijah, you've been when I was testing with it, I mean, it depends on the size of the contest a lot. A small contest is much, much quicker than a really big one. But like to test 1,200 different builds on a like big GPP is like a couple hours, I think.
Yeah,
or
like at least
more,
is
maybe.
it
Like overnight, we can probably run it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. What is the lift to let it be run in the cloud so that we could do like a dozen or more, or like however many at once?
It would be. It would definitely be some work to set that up because there's such long running processes. We have to we'd have to just set up like
we could just use GC
VM
because like we don't care,
but
we don't care how long if it takes 45 seconds to spin up, we're not going to use that in production for people starting their build. But for this,
I see what you're saying. It's just like the infrastructure to set that up is just like a little bit tricky.
What does a little bit mean though? Just like
I would need help with doing that.
Okay.
I'm not sure how to set that up, but I'm sure we could.
Yeah.
We talk to Yuri.
Talk to
Okay.
Talk to Yuri. But
so the reason I think this is important is because at the end of the day, buckets matter because that's the only practical way for people to tell us the contest they're playing, rather than it's like we're not going to recommend. You have to balance it where we're not going to recommend people do a separate build for every single contest that they play because we're assuming that the differences aren't that big. So that's why we want to have buckets. But for the analysis side, these contests run every day. And so we could just ignore buckets and just say, let's look at the optimal slider settings for the MLB relay throw. Because we have enough of a sample size of those that we don't, it's not like to get the sample size necessary to make the analysis significant, we don't need to add other contests to the bucket. The bucketing is, from my point of view, more from a practical side of how do we actually use this. But it almost just seems like if we had a way to automate the analysis, rather than just saying like he can kick off a couple on his computer overnight, but if we had a way to just like kick off all of them at once, it seems like a good.
We can kick off all of them at once. They're just going to be synchronous, but like we can do 10 different contests. It'll just be sequentially, but you can run it on the computer overnight and it'll just like run and analyze all of them.
Have you
It just
have you
isn't
guys
going to be
messed
like
around
parallel.
with like what the performance impacts are of that?
It's locally, it was like very slow. Like I ran one, I think, for 3 contests this morning for like, I think it was like
At the same time?
like synchronously, so like one after the other, and like that process took like at least a couple hours. And those were for like 10,000 entry contests. So if we're looking to do like something bigger,
Wait. So to make sure I'm understanding,
yeah,
are you saying in serial? So like,
yeah,
do one, then when that finishes, you do the next, and when that finishes, you do the
yeah,
next.
that's just like how.
Or are you saying you kick them all off at once?
So I like kick them off at once, but the process itself does them one after the other. Like
Okay.
I
He has a
say,
list. He has a list
yeah.
of 3 contests, and it says,
Yeah.
okay, it'll do contest 1, then contest 2. Then
Can we
contest
just run
3.
this like just
I could do that,
create a
so, like-
separate script and just do it at the same, like in parallel?
I think that's where you need like the deployment, right? Matt, is
I mean, you could do it in parallel. It's just going to use a lot of, it'll. But yeah, I mean, you can run the script in parallel for these different contests at once. I mean, I don't think. Yeah, it'll save some time. I don't know if it's like how much it's.
Yeah, I guess that's why I have no idea. Like
setting that up.
yeah, it's not that. From my experience, it doesn't save that much because the individual contest sims themselves take up like a lot of time. So I feel like it's not saving like a ton of time if we did that.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah, so that's where
Yeah.
the deployment would be good, where it's because if you're running it locally, you've got your processor and it has however many cores and whatever else, and like you could run a few of them at the same time, but you still have that one processor that's doing it all. Whereas if you do it in the cloud, each process can get its own processor.
Yeah. The real bottleneck
so
here is like
thing,
the exponential amount of lineup of builds to test. So that's at least in my experience, like that's like the true bottleneck here is like the exponential number of combinations of builds, unless they're like the number of contests.
Yeah.
But whatever, yeah, that's more of like a practical.
I mean, yeah, Matt, I think this goes back to what you were saying before, but I'm not thinking about it right. If we build the lineups first, we can then score the lineups first, and then does that make the contest analysis faster, or is that sort of already what's done?
No, I mean that would be a good. I think you're right that it would be better to do it that way because we don't need to score for each contest separately because the score is independent. It's just
right. The score is on the lineup, not on the contest.
Though, like the most time consuming part of it is the payout, getting the payouts from like after the score. So like it would save a little bit of time to just score the lineups once, but like what takes by far the most time, because it's just like a complicated process you essentially like have to well, I guess you could score and then like sort them, because essentially you have this list of like all of the scores for like this specific lineup in every sim, and then it's like for every one you have to figure out like what is the payout of that score in that sim, so you kind of have to like match up like. But I think that you could probably I might want to talk to like Julian or Will about the best, like the most efficient like way to do this, but I think what we could do is score them and like sort of sort the scores ahead of time, and then you can kind of just assign them that way. So I think we could rework it, because you're right that if we're analyzing the same lineup in a bunch of different contests, then we don't need to score it more than once. But right now it's sort of like
I would
each contest
prioritize that, just because that's one of the things that it'll pay dividends, because like all the other analysis we do. And then, I guess just going back to the bucketing thing, it's just what I mean by not going too deep into it is like, at the end of the day, there's maybe 50 contests for baseball, like tournaments. And so it's like, we want to just make sure that we're not spending more time figuring out buckets than it would take to just do them all individually. And I know those are separate
and just to
things,
be
but,
clear, we're
yeah.
not like determining the buckets ahead of time to figure out which contest to sim. It's what I was kind of saying is like we go in not thinking about buckets at all. We just like simulate a bunch of different contests, which is sort of what you're saying. I mean, but yeah, we could simulate essentially all of them. And then after that, we figure out the buckets based on the results of
Yeah. No,
those
so like
content
I'm saying
of
like
those
let's just
sims.
simulate
Yeah,
all of them.
right. Yeah. I think I think yeah, I guess we might as well simulate all of them. I feel like some of them, if the contests are like close to identical, then we don't need to sim both. Like if there's a bunch of dime
It's just
times that
not,
are
I
like the
mean, at the
same
end of the day, the
size or like
cost isn't like significant, is it? If we're doing this,
no, it's
if we're
fine.
doing it locally, it's a time cost, but
Right.
um,
No, it's not a cost. It doesn't cost us money to do. I mean, I guess if we deploy it, then it does cost us server money,
right.
but yeah, it's not the significant. Even if we did that, it's not a significant cost. And yeah, for sure, I think we could just essentially take a slate. So I think what we should
What do you have for a
do is
computer, Elijah?
Sorry,
What do you have for a computer?
I have like a M1 Mac.
Okay.
yeah. I mean, I could also like he could run it, and I could also run it on my computer
Yeah.
at the same time. You know, we could kind of if we don't want to do the deployment thing.
I could send
I
that
mean,
like
what
smaller
like
contests. And, yeah.
so what I think the middle ground is just lease a super powerful server and set it up so that like you're not like it's like you can do remote desktop, do whatever you want to do to access it, but just treat that as your machine. Like you're not deploying it to the cloud separately. Like you just have access to this server, run it on that, and so it'll at least be faster.
Mm-hmm.
But is this all like custom code, or is like, I guess what I'm asking is how well do we think it would take advantage of having, say, 20 times as cores to solve on, to analyze on? Because if it's like Python functions that we're relying on, I would assume probably pretty good. But if most of the time is coming from the custom stuff we've built, I'm assuming we just didn't put a ton of thought into parallelization. And so just what would be your guess?
I don't think we would take advantage of the parallel multiple cores at all. I mean, I think having like high performance cores, yeah, but like
right,
it's just a lot of
not
it's
more
all
cores.
Like,
it's
yeah. I mean, we could set it up potentially to like do that. We just need to re-engineer because yeah, like Elijah said, the biggest thing is like running 1,000+ builds sequentially takes a long time. But if we could run them, a bunch of them like batch and like run one build, sim one build per core that we have, then that would make it much faster. And we could definitely do that. I just need to, we just need to re-engineer the code. But I mean, I think first thing is, like we said, is to just restructure the order of operations there, where it's like first we essentially like we choose a slate, we kick off all the builds for that slate, and then like score all of those builds. So essentially, like we have 1,200 builds for each of the lineups. In each of those builds, we have like all of the scores and all of the sims, which is obviously a ton of data. And then once we have all of that, then we just choose which contests to simulate those. And so instead of doing contest first, it's slate first, then builds, then contests, essentially. Because rather than right now where it's like contest, builds, and then or whatever. But yeah. I think that makes sense. So
yeah, so the last thing, I do just think running it locally is a very significant handicap, because it either takes way longer to do analysis that isn't complicated, there's just a lot of it, and I think that means that we either just wait longer to get results, or we're not as thorough in the analysis.
Yeah.
I know this is not simple, but I'm still trying to wrap my head around what you would estimate like the scale of it being, because one would be it scales perfectly, meaning when we build the lineups, it fires up cloud function for each build. Those all run at the same time and produces. Like that would be super fast.
Cloud function is not going to work for this because it takes way too. There's like a 10-minute limit, and it is not.
But what I'm saying is, so like that's what it's the way it's currently set up. But if these were independent builds, which they could be, I'm just saying, build me 1,500 lineups using these settings. Build me 1,500 lineups using these settings. Like those don't have to be done in one process. Do you get what I'm saying?
Oh yeah. Well, the builds aren't. The builds are asynchronous. So we kick off the builds and they just run. It's the simming that's the.
Okay. Yeah. So
So the builds just run with our existing infrastructure. That's all parallel. Cool. So and that's fast. So actually running the builds takes 5 minutes. If that.
Okay. Awesome.
Running 1,200 builds is all done
because it does them independently. Okay.
Because it does them independently, our existing infrastructure. The issue is like the simulating, because it might take like an hour to analyze.
So I mean, one of the things that like, yes, I guess different example, but same principles that I was trying to get at is, it's good that we're leveraging our current infrastructure for the builds, because that doesn't make it much of a bottleneck or any of a bottleneck. But for the analysis, it's like the perfect solution would be spin up a VM for every like independent analysis that we're doing. So if we're looking at 50 contests, we'd spin up 50 and they would all run at the same time. That requires obviously like a lot more like DevOps work, but it seems like there could be a middle ground where we just spin up 10 VMs and we just leave them on, and we just distribute out the process to these 10. It's not scaling up or down. It's just like, hey, like use these ones. They don't change. And that, I would imagine, not that that's simple, but lowers the DevOps burden significantly. Is that like,
I mean, I don't think there's, but there's also not really a difference between doing 10 and doing 50 in terms of like the DevOps cost. So if we're gonna
but I'm saying like if we don't have to worry, but I know a lot of the concerns come around like spinning them up, shutting them down. If it's 10, we just don't shut them down. They're just always running. But if the spinning up and spinning down is not that hard, then sure.
No, that part, I think that spinning up and spinning down is not that hard. I think it's just like actually just getting them set up to like accept the, we have to essentially like, get them set up like with the like Docker image with all the code, and then like have them kind of accept the, we do like a pub sub message to like send all of the input parameters for this, and it would have to like pick it up and run it. But like it's definitely doable because we have similar infrastructure for our sims and builds and stuff like that. So I don't think it's crazy. It's just like a bit over my head, but we could definitely do it.
I would prioritize this because again, it just like this is the direction we want to go with. How we build the product, how we test it all. If we could, exactly.
If it's going to take like a week to run like 50 contests and 1,200 builds, then like that's just too long to. If we
and this is like no slight to you, Elijah. This would be the same with anybody, but like in my opinion, if you are waiting for some process to finish, you're going to find like more analysis and things to do, and I doubt it adds a ton of value. And I'm not saying like you're at that spot right now, but like if it's going to take us days, weeks to get stuff, it's just like you're going to find shiny objects and other things to focus on, where if we can just run it overnight and then the next morning like you have all the data, I feel like we can get through the analysis way faster and focus on those like the core findings without complicating it.
Because it's not even the analysis. This is just like getting the data to then dig through, which is like great.
Exactly.
So I totally.
And then you got to find things to do in the meantime, and I just think it sets it up so it's not an efficient process.
I agree. No, I totally agree.
Matt, so I guess what are the next steps for figuring out what this would take?
So I think what I should do is talk to Yuri about that infrastructure, and maybe he'll have some bandwidth to be able to set that up, or if not, can
Is it
kind of
something
guide.
Brian could do? I know it's not like,
I don't think so.
I know it's not like the code Brian is, he's front end, but like he knows Google Cloud Infrastructure like well. In pubs, like, does he not do anything with PubSub or any of the other stuff, or I don't know.
I don't know.
Okay, yeah. So Yuri's the one to talk to, obviously, but I just wasn't sure what his schedule's like. So okay.
But then, like,
while
basically, as he's doing that, then I would sort of re-engineer the framework a bit to, based on what we talked about, of changing the order of operations for the builds and contests.
Okay.
Yeah.
Does it make sense to? What should Elijah be doing?
I mean, I think Elijah, you can still. I mean, I don't want you to kind of waste your time on this stuff if you're just gonna like redo it.
I mean, I'm happy to start looking at like trends on just like a few contests if that's something that you think there would be value in. So that way, once we have the full amount of data, but I'm happy to also to do something.
Yeah, I would say I think it would make sense to like just do some small stuff, and this wouldn't be the final analysis, but like we don't want to kick off all this stuff and then you realize like, oh, I actually want to like add some additional like metrics to this data, or like we should run it in a different way. Like we should make sure that like once we get to the point where we can do this like 50 contests times 1200 times however many slates we want to do, that like all of the response from like the data that is returned from that is exactly like what we need to analyze. So it seems like it would be worth.
I guess my hesitation is there is a dollar cost to this, but it would, because it can, this process could work so quickly. If we have to run it again with changes, that's not the end of the world.
I agree.
It's like, that's wasteful as far as like dollars go, but I don't want to like over engineer it because we don't want to run it again. Like that's sort of the point of it, is that it would be easy to run again.
Oh, sure. But if Elijah's waiting on.
No. So I think I think, right. So in my opinion, it's figuring out what is the most straightforward way for Elijah to build the scripts, build the whatever, to do analysis. And maybe it's like looking at one contest, maybe it's looking at a handful, like I don't know. And then once we run all of it, it's very easy to just port that over to it. So like when that's done, there's not a bunch more to do.
So that I could do. And also, especially if it's something that you want to be interactive at one point, kind of like similar to the other dashboard that I made for the prop bet and stuff, like that framework does not change. So if that's something that like, you'd want down the road, like I'm happy to start building that out now for like a few contests. But yeah, I'm open to whatever. Don't
worry about the dashboard for now.
Okay.
I would just try to hammer down exactly what the analysis is and do it in a way where like run it on a few contests and then just like do whatever you need to do to get to the findings from there.
That sounds good to me.
Awesome. Anything else you guys want to go over?
No.
Cool. All right. And I know this is obviously going to delay. It's going to take longer for us to get this up and running, but it was going to pay like very big dividends.
For sure.
Once it's in place, and then we'll be able to do this much faster. But awesome. All right, guys, I'll catch you later.
See ya.
Cool. Bye.
See ya.